In May 1775, a Second Continental Congress meets in emergency session.
The delegates that come to Philadelphia again are in a state of agitation and anxiety. It's much different than a year ago for them. A die is being cast and the game is getting much more dangerous than anyone ever anticipated.
It is becoming clear that England will not back down. Congress decides that it must form a national army. It adopts the ragtag collection of volunteers camped around Boston. The choice of a general to lead this new army is crucial. John Hancock, as one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, feels he is the obvious choice. He is pleased when his fellow New Englander, John Adams, rises to nominate a candidate.
I told them that I had but one gentleman in mind. Someone whose skill and experience, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent character would win the approval of all of America and unite the colonies better than any other person in the Union. As I spoke, I watched Hancock's face as he listened to me with visible pleasure. When I announced that this gentleman was from Virginia, his expression suddenly changed from pleasure to mortification and resentment. His mood was not helped when Samuel Adams seconded the motion.
John Adams would tell you that he made George Washington. But John Adams would tell you he made the Revolution as well. John Adams, very adroitly, knowing that it was necessary to bring Virginia enthusiastically into the war, stood up and proposed a Virginian to command this New England army on Cambridge Common. And of course, everyone knew who that was. It was George Washington, who was conveniently enough standing there wearing his Virginia colonel's uniform, almost as a billboard of his availability.
George Washington certainly looks the part. At 6'3", he towers over the other delegates. Unfortunately, his record as an officer leaves much to be desired.
Certainly he had served in the military. His defeat at Fort Necessity began the French and Indian War for all practical purposes. He was there at Braddock's defeat, 1755. I mean, it wasn't, he'd never commanded a successful operation of a major scale. He had military experience, yes, but it's a measure of how little successful large-scale military experience the Americans had, at least in terms of command, that he looked relatively qualified for this position.
Before setting out for Cambridge to take command of the army, the 43-year-old Washington sends a letter to his wife, Martha, at home in Mount Vernon.
Dearest Patsy, I am embarked on a wide ocean from which no safe harbor is to be found. As life is always uncertain, and common prudence dictates to every man the necessity of settling his temporal concerns, and, while the mind is calm and undisturbed, I have gotten Colonel Pendleton to draft a will, which I now enclose. The provision made for you in case of my death will, I hope, be agreeable. P.S. You will be happy to know that I've bought 2 suits of what I am told is the finest cloth. I am sure you will be pleased to hear that I paid 50 shillings a suit, which comes out to only 20 shillings a yard.
Nobody in the colonies really knows what to do next. At this moment of hesitation, a 50-page pamphlet is published which will change the course of history. Written by Thomas Paine, an obscure journalist recently arrived from England, it is called Common Sense.
It's surprising, but nothing will clear up our situation so quickly, so efficiently, as an open and determined declaration for independence. Until this happens, we are like that man who puts off some unpleasant business day after day. He knows it has to be done. He hates to start doing it. He wishes it were all over, and he's haunted by the fact that he knows he has no other choice. The blood of those already killed cries out for it. It is time to part.
Tom Paine was born in England in 1738. He attempted several careers, from corset maker to customs collector. He was a failure at all of them. When he came to Philadelphia in 1774, he brought with him a burning rage against the privileged classes and against the injustice of the British political system.
Paine, of course, is a political radical and a very definitely what I suppose would probably be called a loose cannon in America, the kind of person you're embarrassed to have on your side. Paine is a subversive. You know, if you're a respectable slave-owning, plantation-owning gentleman, not necessarily a natural friend. Tom Paine is not the kind of man you invite to tea at Mount Vernon.
He was a common man, a laboring man, and a well-read man besides, but certainly not of the caliber of the other patriots, who were well-born, merchants, planters. He was not of that socioeconomic class, and that perhaps gave him an insight into the Republican ideals as they really should have been lived, which the other patriots didn't have. Many of the patriots considered the people rabble. For Paine, the common people were the revolution. The simplicity of the language and common sense made revolution something that was available to everyone and that everyone was a part of.
Paine is not only calling for independence, he is also proposing a radical new idea, that ordinary people can understand and participate in government, that they do not need a king.
When planning for the future, let us remember King George, that sottish, stubborn, worthless, brutal man, the sceptred savage of Great Britain. Remember that virtue and ability are not hereditary.
It was that transformation of government that was at the kernel of the revolutionary character of the American Revolution. Paine would say that in later times, said the independence alone would not have made much difference, but the establishment of a government in which authority was given to the people made the American Revolution an event of world significance.
We have it in our power to begin the world anew. It is the opportunity to bring forward a system of government in which the rights of all men should be preserved, that gives value to independence. O ye that love mankind, ye that dares oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. America shall make a stand, not for herself alone, but for the world.
Common Sense instantly becomes the greatest bestseller the country has ever known. Parts of it are reprinted in newspapers around the country. It is read aloud after church, in taverns, and at town meetings. Officers read it to their troops. From meeting houses in New England, to farms in Delaware, to the streets of Williamsburg, Virginia, ordinary people are making their voices heard. The tide is turning in favor of independence.
Declaration of Independence, for me, is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever seen.
It's a revolutionary document for a revolutionary statement.
You cannot help but be stirred when you read those words.
Thomas Jefferson's writing is absolutely magnificent. And when he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," that was the first time anybody had bothered to write that down.
And then you turn the clock back and think of when he was writing, how young he was, what a statement it was given the history of the world at that point. And you feel the excitement of being on the cusp of something so profound that it's hard to put it into words.
If you review our Declaration of Independence, it has those beautiful words about all men are created equal and governments are formed among men to represent the people. It was a good statement of what we were all about. And that's the only thing people remember about the Declaration of Independence, that it was about all men are created equal. But it's really roughly a 28-count indictment against King George. And therefore, because of the way in which the British Crown treated us, we now declare that we are a free country, and we want to let you know why. Now, if we're going to have a war, we're going to have a war.
In 1776, you have the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, debating a unified position for the colonies with respect to the hostilities that have already broken out. And the fundamental issue between them is, are they fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire, or are they going to fight for independence? And they're seriously divided. People who are perfectly willing to resist the tyranny of the British government are not necessarily willing to strike for independence. But there's a groundswell in favor of it, I think, in large measure because they recognize that having provoked the lion this far, there's no going back.
All of a sudden you have this group of people who are going, no, we're not part of some great chain of being with the king at the top of it. We are free people. We can vote for who we want to have in charge. And we're not going to tolerate you telling us that we have some class status we have to be trapped in. It says, you know, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, meaning that Parliament in London, the King himself, the courts cannot interfere and take away your rights because the state can't take power from us. Even to this day, it's probably the most central difference between America and every other country in the world.
It goes well beyond what was needed in order to declare independence. It establishes a philosophical basis for a civil democracy in which all persons are guaranteed rights by virtue of their personhood.
This political genius, not just in Jefferson, but in Adams and all the other people who collected here, they saw a new time for humankind, which is that we can be free and that we can make decisions for ourselves.
Franklin quickly learns to play politics French style. He becomes a master of that uniquely Parisian institution, the salon. It is at these late-night dinner parties that the movers and shakers of French politics could themselves be shaken and moved.
So again, it's Franklin adapting. He realizes the pace of life is different. He realizes the approach to work is different. And he realizes that much is done on a very social platform.
Franklin was a salon superstar, primarily because he was witty and supremely accomplished. But Ben also dressed for success. one of the great masquerades of his career.
And he understood almost at once, almost intuitively, that the French would not be impressed with some pretender trying to dress as elegantly as they did. The way to their hearts was to be a simple backwoods Quaker. Franklin was never a Quaker. Franklin never lived anywhere near the backwoods in his entire life. But he began sending back to his buddies in Pennsylvania, "I need shipments of coonskin caps," and those ludicrous coonskin caps that he had never worn in his life. He begins wearing to every salon, to every public appearance. He played it to the hilt.
The French were enthralled. And as Franklin's fame grew, so did the envy of certain other Americans. In particular, Franklin's ease with Parisian women, whom he sometimes referred to as his mistresses, stands in stark contrast to the tortured efforts of John Adams, another member of the American delegation.
Franklin and Adams had two very different approaches to the French. You can even see it in the way they learned the French language. Franklin talks about how he learned to speak French by lounging on the pillows of his French mistresses, whereas Adams learned to speak French by memorizing a volume of French funeral orations. So they have a totally different style.
He speaks of Franklin's charm as if it ought to be a controlled substance or something. And there's almost an eternal friction between the sort of classic over and classic underachiever, between the class nerd and the most popular guy, between Adams and Franklin.
He goes to Paris and he discovers that Franklin is the lion of French society and Adams is a nothing. In fact, the people of Paris get him confused with Samuel Adams. And they're always, well, they end up just calling him the other Adams.
Even routine office work ended in fits of sputtering rage for the other Adams. John would be at work early, and Ben would stroll in at noon after a late night at the salon.
Adams thought it was ironic that the person who had spoken about early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, John Adams had grown up on Poor Richard's Almanac. And here was the author of Poor Richard's Almanac not following that kind of advice at all. But Franklin understood that he was actually getting more business done for the American mission at 2 o'clock in the morning in somebody's salon than Adams did at 8 o'clock in the morning in the office. That's simply the way the world of Parisian politics worked.
In Ben's view, John was a mixed blessing. He means well for his country, noted Franklin, and is always an honest man, but in some things, absolutely out of his senses. The French find Adams even more annoying. The foreign minister refuses to deal with him. It is Franklin who patiently works the French government for more than a year. In February of 1778, after learning of a significant American victory at Saratoga, Louis XVI finally signs on the dotted line.
Next to George Washington, Benjamin Franklin is probably the most indispensable person when it comes to winning the revolution.
Now, what had been a trickle of covert arms becomes a potent battlefield alliance. A steady stream of weapons and soldiers arrive in America.
France then provides 90% of the gunpowder we used in the revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette has almost as many French troops at Yorktown as George Washington has American troops. So that's what allows us to win the revolution militarily.